South of Thoratius lie the ruins of the Bastille prison. This prison during the rule of Duke Henry III was the stage of an experiment aimed to reform the prison system in the Toussant region, favoring rehabilitation instead of strict retribution. The Duke forbade physical punishments, propriety restrictions, even going as far as allowing prisoners to roam freely inside the prison's perimeter. But something went awfully wrong. An act like that of Duke Henry III of Toussant must have been pretty revolutionary to a world that, apart from monsters, witches, and other fantasy tropes, has many similarities with our Middle Ages. Historically, torture was a standard procedure in Europe before the late 17th century. And particularly in the Middle Ages, whenever the authorities needed a confession in cases involving serious crimes, they were not only allowed, but even encouraged to seek it by inflicting corporal punishments. As we read in chapter 14 of Prowess, Piety and Public Order in Medieval Society, it wasn't rare that a percentage of the confiscated wealth of the convicted was given by the jurisdictional lord to sheriffs, constables, judges and whoever executed the sentence, in retribution for their service, of course. So it appears opportunity not only makes a thief, but also his torturer. But in more recent years, thanks to illuminated sovereigns such as the whistleblowing King Frederick the Great of Prussia, who abolished torture in 1740, and Pietro Leopoldo of Tuscany, who adopted new codes inspired by jurist Cesare Beccaria, the rules of penal procedures were about to change. Now back to the game. Entering the ruins of the prison from south, you'll find a corpse of a clerk who went to that location searching for a chest containing coins meant for Bastille prison's provisions. You'll find a key in his diary after looting his corpse. Wandering around the ruins, you run into a hooded figure, who will soon reveal itself to be an Alp. Alps, much like Bruxas or Brujas, are vampires. They have red hair and fight without clothing, often going completely invisible. Since they are vampires, black blood and vampire oils are always useful. In another chest you'll find a formula for black armor dye, and beside the chest you'll find a purse containing some crowns, the diagram for Toussant's ducal guard captain's armors and trousers, and a document named Work Orders. In this document you'll find a series of dispositions that were to be implemented in the prison, signed by Dr. Phillip George Zimbardo. Does it ring a bell?
What are you doing?
Dr. Phillip George Zimbardo is an American psychologist and professor at Stanford University who, apart from being the standard reference for movie villains who confidently pull off a devilish goatee, is also famous for his classic Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, Zimbardo, with a government grant from the US Office of Naval Research, conducted the Stanford Prison Study in which male college students were selected from an applicant pool of 70 and randomly assigned to be prisoners or guards in a mock prison located in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford. Zimbardo's goal for the Stanford Prison Study was to assess the psychological effect on a student of becoming a prisoner or a prison guard. Zimbardo himself took part in the study, playing the role of prison superintendent who could mediate disputes between guards and prisoners. He instructed guards to find ways to dominate the prisoners, not with physical violence, but with other tactics, verging on torture such as sleep deprivation and punishment with solitary confinement. Later in the experiment, some guards became more aggressive, taking away prisoners' cots so that they had to sleep on the floor, and forcing them to use buckets kept in their cellars as toilets. But neither the other guards nor Zimbardo himself intervened. Knowing that their actions were observed but not rebuked, guards considered that they had implicit approval for such actions. Less than 2 full days into the study, one inmate began suffering from depression, uncontrolled rage, crying, and other mental dysfunctions. The prisoner was eventually released after screaming and acting unstable in front of the other inmates. This prisoner was later replaced with one of the alternates. In later interviews, several guards told the interviewers that they knew what Zimbardo wanted to have happened, and they did their best to make that happen. By the end of the study, the guards had complete control over all of their prisoners and were using their authority to its greatest extent. Prisoners and guards had rapidly adapted to their roles, stepping beyond the boundaries of what had been predicted and leading to dangerous and psychologically damaging situations. Zimbardo concluded that situations can have a more powerful influence over our behavior than most people appreciate and few people recognize. But is it really? The experiment didn't have a control group to begin with. Control groups are used in scientific research to be sure that the result obtained in the treated group is still relevant when you change a given variable. In medical research, for instance, to test for the effects of a medication on a certain disease, one group is given the actual medication and the other one just a placebo. For the medication to be considered effective, it should produce a higher statistical efficacy in treating the disease than the placebo does. So the Stanford Prison Experiment hardly classifies as a rigorous scientific experiment by today's standards. Recently, the footage and recordings of the experiment have been published and thoroughly analyzed. These show that there have been instances where Zimbardo and his collaborators pressed the guards for a certain type of behavior. Thibault published a peer-reviewed article arguing that the guards knew what results the experiment was supposed to produce. The fact that Zimbardo himself took part in the experiment is in itself a big methodological problem. Whichever the field of work, scientists desperately try to remove themselves from the events that they are observing and describing. And it's easy to imagine why this is even more important when you try to analyze and classify human behavior. Adding your own whole set of expectations as a variable of your experiment is the perfect way to unwillingly skew your results towards the direction you desire. Another critique to the experiment was brought up by Peter Gray. He argued that the study presented demand characteristics and thus the participants were more likely to act the way the researchers prospected. To avoid this kind of bias, the test subjects should be swayed from the original scope of the experiment, deceived into believing that the experimenters are testing another set of hypotheses instead of the actual one. In addition to all of this, it must be noted that the sample of subjects chosen for the experiment was small and unrepresentative of the greater population, being composed of 24 American male students only. In 2018, Vsauce dig deeper into the experiment in their series Minefield. They even set up another similar one, coherent with the required scientific standards, and the results, unsurprisingly, were quite different from the original study. Zimbardo to this day continues to assert the validity of the Stanford Prison Experiment. He used it in the famous Abu Ghraib scandal and following judiciary case in aid of the accused soldiers who were tasked with guarding the prison with no prior training. In the end, although heavily biased, the experiment made its way into pretty much every social psychology textbook. There certainly exists a threshold over which personality traits can get twisted by external pressures, thus resulting in the exploitation of a position of power. But this experiment doesn't rule out the role of the perpetrator's personality. The way the subjects were recruited for the study created demand characteristics, attracting people that would have perhaps liked the idea of being the bad guard. The same reasoning can be applied to the Abu Ghraib case. The guards were actually soldiers, which on average are more prone to violence than an average person, and a hierarchical order based on harsh retribution could even be part of their core values. In my opinion, this experiment could be better suited to explain what happens when great power is given to personnel that also already have a propension for dominance and are not trained to exert said power in a proper manner while abiding by the expectations of fitting their role. We will never know what exactly went wrong in the Toussant Prison Experiment and what followed up Henry III's reform. But thanks to the Stanford Prison Experiment, there has been a surge in similar studies that focused on improving the prison system and the personnel selection methods. So in the end, thank you for your study, General Zod. Hans Gruber.